I need to explain clearly from the beginning that this story is about the night I discovered a stranger had been slowly living inside my apartment for weeks without me noticing. And everything started with small things that looked harmless at first. I lived with my 3-year-old son in a small second-floor apartment in a quiet building. And our routine was always simple because I worked evenings while my sister watched my son until I came home around midnight. One night, I walked into the kitchen and noticed the refrigerator door slightly open even though I clearly remembered closing it before leaving. And inside one yogurt container was half empty, although I had not touched it. I assumed my sister had eaten it while watching my son, so I ignored the detail and went to bed. But the next night, another small change appeared when I saw a chair slightly moved away from the table. My sister insisted she had not moved anything when she left earlier that evening. And although the explanation sounded strange, I blamed my own memory and moved on. 2 days later, I returned from work and noticed a glass sitting beside the sink that neither my sister nor I remembered using. And there were faint fingerprints on the rim that looked larger than mine. I washed the glass and tried not to think about it. Yet that same week, my son began pointing toward the hallway closet and saying that someone had taken one of his crackers while I was gone. I opened the closet, expecting nothing unusual. But inside, the smell of food wrappers and dust felt stronger than before. And I saw crumbs scattered on the floorboards near the wall. The building was old and had narrow maintenance spaces behind some closets, so I assumed mice had gotten inside and decided I would check the panel another day. Over the next week, more items moved in small ways that were impossible to prove, but impossible to ignore, including a spoon left on the counter and a blanket that looked folded differently on the couch. One night, my son woke me by saying someone had opened his bedroom door earlier and watched him while he pretended to sleep. And although I checked every room, I found nothing unusual. I stayed awake longer after that night, listening carefully for movement in the apartment. Yet the rooms stayed quiet until one evening when I heard a soft scraping sound behind the hallway wall. The sound repeated twice, as if something inside the wall had shifted its weight. And when I opened the closet, I noticed the maintenance panel was slightly pushed outward from its frame. I crouched down and pulled the panel open, expecting to see pipes or wires. But instead, there was a narrow, empty space leading deeper into the wall structure of the building. The space looked large enough for a person to crawl through, and on the wooden floor inside were several crushed food packages and an empty water bottle that did not belong to me. I stood there holding the panel while the apartment remained silent around me. And then I heard slow breathing from somewhere inside the wall passage. I pushed the panel closed immediately and locked the closet door with a chair pressed against it. Then I carried my son into my bedroom and waited quietly until morning. When daylight came, I convinced myself the breathing had been my imagination, and the trash inside the wall had been left by construction workers years earlier. That afternoon, I cleaned the closet and screwed the panel shut as tightly as I could, believing the problem was finally solved. For the next 3 days, nothing unusual happened, and the apartment felt normal again. So I relaxed and returned to our usual routine. On the 4th night, I woke suddenly because my bedroom door was slowly closing on its own, while the hallway light was already on. I stepped into the hallway and saw the closet chair moved aside and the panel hanging open again. And inside the dark space, there were fresh footprints in the dust. I backed into my bedroom and locked the door while holding my son in my arms. And then I listened carefully as someone crawled slowly through the wall behind the apartment. The crawling sound moved closer to the bedroom wall and then stopped completely. And for several minutes, there was only silence while I waited beside the door. That's when I thought it was over. I had no idea what was about to happen next. The story isn't over. Subscribe the channel to continue. I stayed awake, holding my son, while the apartment remained silent. And sometime near dawn, the bedroom doorknob slowly turned from the outside, but stopped when it met the lock. The handle stayed pressed downward for several seconds, as if someone was testing it carefully. And then the pressure released and footsteps moved quietly away down the hallway. I waited until the building hallway filled with morning noise before unlocking the door. And when I stepped out, I saw muddy shoe prints across the living room floor, leading directly to the kitchen sink. On the counter beside the sink, there was a knife from my own drawer, placed neatly on a folded napkin. And the refrigerator door stood open again, with several items missing. I grabbed my son and left the apartment immediately. But when I returned that afternoon with my sister, we found the maintenance panel removed entirely and the wall passage empty. My sister helped me block the opening with a heavy dresser, while we tried to understand how someone had entered without anyone in the building noticing. That evening, I decided to stay awake in the living room while my son slept beside me on the couch. And for hours, the apartment stayed quiet while traffic passed outside the windows. Just after midnight, a scraping noise came again from behind the dresser, and the heavy wood slowly shifted forward as something pushed from the other side of the wall. I pulled my son into my arms and moved toward the front door, but the dresser suddenly tipped forward, and a thin man crawled halfway into the room while holding the same kitchen knife. His clothes were dirty and torn, as if he had been hiding inside walls for days, and his eyes stayed fixed on the food on the table rather than on us. I shouted for him to leave while backing toward the door. Yet he continued crawling forward and grabbed a loaf of bread from the table with shaking hands. My son started crying loudly beside me, while the man stood up fully inside the apartment. and in the confusion, the knife slipped from his hand onto the floor. I rushed toward the door, hoping to get outside with my child. But the man suddenly grabbed my arm and tried to pull me back toward the kitchen. I struggled to break free while holding my son tightly. And during the struggle, my child slipped from my grip and fell hard against the corner of the table. The sound of his head hitting the wood stopped everything in the room instantly. And when I lifted him, his body stayed completely still in my arms. The man stepped backwards slowly while staring at the child. And then he ran into the wall passage and disappeared through the opening before I could move. I sat on the floor holding my son while the apartment remained silent again. And the dresser still leaned against the broken panel where the man had entered. My sister arrived minutes later and saw me sitting there with my son unmoving in my arms, and the knife still lying on the floor where it had fallen. The man was never seen again inside the building after that night. Yet the broken wall passage remained as a reminder of how easily he had been living inside our home. I moved out of that apartment the same week because every room reminded me of the moment. My son fell beside the table. The maintenance workers later sealed the wall completely. But the memory of that narrow space inside the building never disappeared from my mind. One last question. If you were in her place at that moment, would you have done the same? Be honest. What does her choice deserve out of 10? Subscribe now. The best story is coming next.